In this video, I wanted to talk to you about what I consider to be the greatest scam in medical and food history. So what is the greatest scam in history? Here it is right here. Yes, the food pyramid. It's something that most of us are very familiar with. Today I wanted to tell you the story of how we got in the mess we are in. Because believe me, we are in an awful mess with food and medicine and the whole kit and caboodle there. We started talking about this in the last video when we talked about doctors. And we discussed the Hippocratic oath that doctors take, in essence, to do no harm. If you missed that video, you can go back and watch it. But today, I'm going to focus on how we got in the mess we're in. What got us to this messed up, crazy place that we are in today? This is a story that I believe everybody needs to know. It needs to be widely told. You need to read up on this. You need to know this story because it is so fundamentally important to understand where we screwed up and how we can put it right. All of these events that I'm talking about have happened in the last 60 to 70 years. So they're very recent events in the terms of the whole calendar. Let me paint a picture for you of health 70 years ago. All you've got to do is think of your grandparents or your great-grandparents maybe and ask yourself what sort of health did they have and what sort of conditions did they battle with their health, because it was a very different world to what we're faced with today. 70 years ago, obesity was very rare. Well, we could come much more modern than that. I'm 60, just about turning 69. I could think back to when I was at school, a high school of about 1,000 kids, and I could only ever remember one obese kid in the school, and of course we called him Slim. He was the exception rather than the norm, but now over half the kids in our schools are obese. 70 years ago, hardly anybody had heard the term diabetes. And yet today it's a household term. And today we are faced with millions of people being diagnosed with diabetes and millions more that have it that have never been diagnosed and don't even know they've got it. 70 years ago we'd never heard of fatty liver disease. 70 years ago we'd not even heard of heart disease. To have a heart attack 70 years ago was really unheard of. This came to a head and we got to a decisive turning point in 1955. In 1955, President Eisenhower in the United States had a heart attack. And it gripped headlines around the world because it was such a rare event. Fast forward a few decades and it is now by far the biggest killer right around the Western world. So what went terribly wrong back in these last decades? Well, as I said before, it's a story we need to know. Basically, there was two schools of thought emerging about what causes a heart attack. A heart attack was relatively new to the world, and yet within a decade or two, it's going to be everywhere. It's going to spread like the bubonic plague to the state that we are in today. Over in the UK, there was a man by the name of John Yudkin. He was a professor, a PhD, and he proved that sugar was the villain. And he wrote this book, Pure, White and Deadly. And the book was a major warning to the world about the danger of sugar. He wrote that in 1972. We should have listened to him. But instead, we chose to go with Side B. Side B was headed up by this man here. One Ancel Keys. Ancel Keys was tall. He was a very distinguished, good-looking man. He was a great orator. He had charisma oozing out of his veins. He was a man who could command attention and a man who wielded a great deal of authority. about the same time that John Yudkin was starting to sound out his warnings about sugar, Ancel Key's got funding, a substantial amount of funding from the US government to conduct what became known as his 7-country study. What he did, in fact, was to do case studies on a number of different countries to show that there was a direct simulation between how much fat they produced and the number of heart attacks they experienced. And he produced a beautiful straight graph to demonstrate his point. The problem was that although he had researched 21 countries, he only picked 7 countries. And he picked the 7 countries that were most compatible with his theory, his hypothesis that fat was to blame, particularly saturated fat was to blame in the cause of heart attacks. He had vast funding behind him. He had political clout. He had political contacts. He had all sorts of strings he could pull. And anybody who disagreed with him, he could just cut them down without any trouble at all. And he could make them look like idiots. Ancel Key continued to believe and to push and to persuade the theory that saturated fat causes a heart attack for the whole of his life. He lived to over 100 years old, so maybe he had something going for him. Yet his study today is widely condemned among scientists, medical researchers, and all the people who have looked at this in any detail. It is generally considered that his theory was deeply flawed, if not blatantly wrong. I think what happened with Ancel Key is that he had held on to this hypothesis, this theory, decade after decade in his life. He staked his reputation on it. He staked his family. He staked his career on it. He staked everything he had on it. So there was no going back. And it didn't matter how loud the dissenting voices were, and there were many, he had the political power and the persuasive ability to silence them. So Ancel Key's hypothesis was something like this. It had 4 or 5 steps to it. Step 1 was to say that saturated fat, if you eat saturated fat, i.e. meat, mainly because that's where most of the saturated fat is, that will cause your cholesterol to rise. Secondly, he said that the high cholesterol will cause atherosclerosis. Never get my tongue around that word. Particularly the LDL. His theory was that the LDL will build up from all the saturated fat, and that this will form plaque that will penetrate the arteries around your heart, causing them to harden and to clog up, and to ultimately cause a heart attack or a stroke. So his hypothesis called for a dramatic reduction in the amount of saturated fat we eat and the amount of cholesterol we eat, although they later proved that the cholesterol you eat has almost zero bearing on the cholesterol in your blood. Now in the United States, because of his political persuasion and connection, Ancel Key was able to get the government to formally adopt his hypothesis as government policy. Can you see what's happened here? Somebody who has a very flawed hypothesis that has since been proven to be faulty in so many ways was able to engineer and able to wriggle this thing through and to use his charm and persuasion, his charisma and his clout and his power to get this thing adopted by government. Can you see a problem? Well, what happened then? The floodgates opened. In 1977, the US government released a document called Dietary Goals for the United States, outlining how people should eat to avoid a heart attack. This little document called for the same things that Ancel Key was calling for a dramatic reduction in saturated fat and in cholesterol-laden foods. Out of that little paper that the US government produced came the food pyramid. Now the food pyramid, it got even more murky, because not only did we have Ancel Key and his diet heart hypothesis, but by this time we've got big players entering the field. People like Alan G. White, who was regarded as the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist, who wrote extensively about health and diet and supported a vegetarian diet. A member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church was a man called Kellogg, from where we get Kellogg's cornflakes. He had some very extreme ideas that eating fat and cholesterol caused an increase in masturbation and impure thoughts. So he set about his mission to manufacture food that was in keeping with the guidelines of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. At the same time, the American government started to heavily subsidize farmers growing corn. They subsidized it so much that the American nation had an oversupply of corn. So what do they do with all of this corn? They discovered that they could make it into a product called fructose corn syrup, in essence sugar. And to this day, fructose corn syrup is in a multitude of products. So the food lobby also entered the debate in Parliament and pushed to have their grains and their cereals at the base of the pyramid, saying that we should eat more grains and more cereals than anything else. And this was decided upon not by food scientists, not by doctors, not by medical researchers, but by the United States government being pressured by lobby groups such as the sugar and the grain industry. A lot of money changed hands and massive injustice was done. There were dissenting voices of medical researchers and scientists at the time, but they were silenced. Their research papers were somehow lost and mislaid and not examined. And so the United States, and in turn the Western world, officially adopted the food pyramid. That was the greatest scam in medical history. So things went from bad to worse. Once that pyramid was adopted, a number of things happened in quick succession. First of all, low-fat food flooded the market. And do you know, even today, you go into your supermarket where they're selling these packaged products, and nearly every one of them will have a low-fat label on it somewhere, because we became obsessed with eating low fat. The second thing that happened was that ultra-processed food just exploded. Ultra-processed food is really an edible food-like substance that comes in a packet or a box and has a barcode on it. You think of all the things that fit that description at your supermarket even today. The supermarket is filled with this processed crap, and it flooded the market in response to the food pyramid. The other thing that happened at this time was that people said, well, if we can't have saturated fat, we've got to get rid of the butter. And so there was big companies, Procter & Gamble and some of these big wide companies, that started to manufacture what we know today as vegetable oil. It's anything but vegetable oil. These products, these seed oils, are manufactured in factories. They're manufactured by putting the oil under immense pressure of steaming it, of boiling it, of colouring it, of flavouring it. It is anything but natural. But these oils flooded the market because they were polyunsaturated. And this is what we've got to cook with now. And we were given products like Crisco and canola oil and soy oil and vegetable oil and sunflower oil, and so the list goes on. These things were diabolical. They were never fit for human consumption, and they're still not fit for human consumption. If you've got them in your cupboard, get rid of them. Learn to cook again in butter, tallow, fat. And then the fourth thing that happened after this food pyramid was adopted was that junk food exploded. We had the rise of places like McDonald's and all sorts of these places that sell fast food that's really junk food, and they exploded everywhere. So they told us to cut down on our meat, to stop using butter, to use margarine and to use seed oils instead. And they told us to radically reduce our meat consumption. And so do you know what we did? We did exactly what we were told. And if you looked at the graphs, both in America, in Australia, wherever in the Western world you want to look, have a look at meat consumption in the last 50 years. It's gone down. Have a look at the consumption of things like butter, also gone down. We did what we were told. We got rid of the meat, we got rid of the butter, we used margarine, we used seed oils, and we ate vegetables. And very occasionally we might have a bit of meat, but if we did, we cut every skerrick of meat off that. We also became very wary of eggs because we know that they've got cholesterol in them. We did exactly what we were told. So what happened between then and today? I'll tell you what happened. Obesity exploded across the Western world. Diabetes type 2 exploded. It's now a household name. Fatty liver disease, not just caused by alcohol, but what they call non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, exploded around the globe. Insulin resistance exploded. They're saying now that up to 83% of the Western population could have insulin resistance. And of course, the biggest one of all is that heart disease has absolutely exploded. We did what we were told. We cut down the meat, we cut out the fat, and we got a whole lot sicker. It's worse than that. Let me tell you this. Millions of people have died because they believed the food pyramid, and they acted on the advice that the government gave them. This is the greatest scam in medical history. The primary drivers for a heart attack are not saturated fat and are not cholesterol. The primary drivers today are inflammation, insulin resistance, and metabolic syndrome. That's where we should be putting our attention. We've blamed cholesterol and fat when we should have blamed sugar and processed food and seed oils. But let me tell you something quite shocking, you probably already know it, is that doctors today are still trained in the model proposed by Ancel Keys. And so a doctor today will get a blood test ordered for you, and the first thing they're going to look at is your LDL, and they're going to tell you your LDL is a bit high. It's going to put you at higher risk of having a heart attack, and therefore what do they want to do? They want to put you on a statin that's manufactured by Big Pharma. Not just manufactured by them, it is their biggest selling product in the world. The statin market around the world today is worth something like $25 billion. And it's growing exponentially every single year. Not only that, but doctors will warn you about eating red meat. And they will tell you that eating red meat can cause cancer. And yet this is despite the fact that, as we said in the last video, doctors have virtually no training in nutrition. So where did they get this idea about red meat causing cancer? They got it from what they were taught. And it's what they continue to parrot to their patients today. Our whole health system has been sold to Big Pharma, and I could add to Big Food. And the tragedy is our medical system does not even know it's been sold. And Big Pharma tightly controls the whole of our medical system. they have their finger in every medical pie. They exert massive control over the medical industry. It's a neatly packaged system, you need to understand. Doctors are part of the system. They are locked into the system, and they are pressured in so many different ways to conform to the system. What Big Pharma don't want is a doctor starting to tell patients, you don't need a statin, you just need to eat a healthy diet, because their profit is under threat. Big Pharma have no interest in you getting well. They have colossal interest in you being sick, because as long as you are sick, they are making money off you. The day you get better, they make no more money. I had a doctor just a month ago, not my own doctor, but I had a cardiologist tell me that I should take a statin. I said, how long would I have to take it for? He said, the rest of your life. You see what I mean? They are part of a system. And so you go in and see your doctor. You get your blood test done, your LDL is high, they immediately say that's a risk of a heart attack, I want you on a statin. And they've had no discussion about your diet, no discussion about your lifestyle, no discussion about anything else that's happening in your life. They simply see the LDL and say, take a statin. That, my friends, is a dereliction of duty on the part of doctors. And I'm going to give to my dying breath to change that in our nation and in our world, because it's a sacrilege and it ought not never to happen. If you missed the first video in this series when I talked about the Hippocratic Oath that doctors make, I will leave a link for it above. But I wanted to say thank you for watching today. Please join our Facebook community, the Facebook Pensioner, and I would love to see you on the third and final video, when I want to bring some hope. I want to bring some good news to you about what we can actually do to make a difference in this horrible situation that we've inherited, because I believe ordinary people like you and I can make a big difference. So that's the next video in this series. Thank you for watching. I will see you on the next video, and until then, keep telling your story.